Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know everyone's lunch hour is very time sensitive, so we won't delay in getting our program started today. Welcome everyone to the Tennessee State Museum. Thank you, Rachel. My name is Jeff Sellers. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement here at the museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. We have a great program in store for you. I know I'm personally super excited about our talk today and our guest speaker. Before we do that, let me go over a few housekeeping things for our Lunch and Learn. It is a Lunch and Learn, so do enjoy your food. We do have trash cans on either side. You can just dispose of that whenever you finish your lunch. And so enjoy your time here at the museum. Please visit our galleries at the end of our program today if you have time. We also have an evaluation form. If you have not picked up one of those, we encourage your feedback. We're always looking for ideas from you on what kinds of programs you'd like to see here at the museum. So please take time to fill out that feedback survey for us. Without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. We're very, very excited to have Dr. Angela Keaton, all the way from Tusculum College. She has made the trek here to Nashville. We're very, very appreciative for her doing so. Dr. Keaton teaches U.S. survey courses in modern African and Asian history, gender history, historical research and writing, modern America, and American pop culture. So she's quite busy. While at Tusculum, she has served in a variety of faculty leadership positions, including serving as the director of Warren W. Hobby Center for Civic Advancement, and as a member of the College Council, director of the Honors Program, the Teaching and Professional Growth Committee, Assessment Committee, and the QEP Implementation Team. Her recently published article entitled Backyard Desperados, Americans' Attitudes Concerning Toy Guns in the Cold War Era, won the Carl Bode Award for the best article published in the Journal of American Culture in 2010. She's here today to speak to us about discovering women through material culture. Let's welcome Dr. Keaton to the museum today.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the museum for inviting me to speak today. It's a magnificent facility with some really terrific employees, so I hope you have time to look around here. We'll get started with the benefits of her industry, material culture, and the hidden work of women. Thanks to programs like Antiques Roadshow, interest in historical objects and material culture has received a great deal of attention in recent years. We tune in to hear the stories behind the objects, and perhaps more than anything, we tune in to see whose trash is really treasure. So we have an example here. Grandma's hand-me-down blanket, drum roll, ended up being worth almost $1 million. And my personal favorite, the garage sale table purchased by this woman for $25, ended up being a very important 18th century demi-lune table, one of only 6 in existence, and sold for over $500,000. But on the show, we rarely get more than a snippet of the history associated with each item. But if we really study these items, we gain insight that is often more valuable than the worth of these objects. Until recent decades, written documents were often the domain of historians. But we know that artifacts often speak louder than words because they give voice to the voiceless, because millions of people unfortunately leave few documents behind. So we have to turn to material culture. So what is material culture? It refers to the physical aspects of a culture. It could be objects, like we're going to talk about today, spaces, items created for use, and that are utilitarian or aesthetic. It can be tools, paintings, quilts, even food, all of the items you see housed in this building. But what can it tell us? The function of an item tells us how people found solutions to problems. The materials at their disposal, trade networks, or standards of living. They also tell us how people lived, the division of labor, and the complexity of a society. Information about everyday life, how people spent their time, their values. It can also tell us about the economy, changes in society, and reveal to us facts about environmental change. Ultimately, material culture is a window into the past that can be richer than written text if we know how to evaluate them. So today we're going to focus on 4 pieces of material culture in particular that are not exclusively limited to women and household production, but items that were certainly a major part of women's work in the household. When we think of what women made in early America, we probably think of quilts, and you have a lovely exhibit about those upstairs, food, and babies. But when we assess items made by women in the household for household use, we realize that the notion of women as just household producers is complicated. And we probably tend to ignore household production of Native American and African American women altogether. So let's explore 4 items to see what they can reveal to us about American women. And these items are the hooked rug here, a Native American sifter basket, a dress made by an African American slave, and a butter stamp. All right, we'll begin with the hooked rug. Hooked rugs can tell us about trade. Thank you. Can tell us about trade, agriculture, industry, and the economy. So this is a hooked wool rug from New England. They are made by taking strips of wool about a 1/4 inch wide and looping them through widely woven burlap to create various designs. The density of the wool loops actually makes the rugs very durable and sturdy. So our story has to begin with the wool. New England colonists were furious that the English Wool Act of 1699 made it illegal for colonists to export wool because they had invested in raising large sheep herds, ignoring the ban on importing sheep from England to the colonies. For the English, however, 66% of their foreign trade in the 17th century depended on wool, so they were eager to protect their market. New Englanders, being very ingenious, illegally bought sheep from Dutch traders. Wolves, Native Americans, and colonists liked to eat the sheep, and winters were hard in New England. But by 1664, there were over 100,000 sheep in Massachusetts alone. And by the time of the ban on wool exports, the number of sheep had grown. Colonists found themselves awash in a sea of surplus woolen fabrics. And they used much of that to make textile products for the household beyond clothing, like these rugs. So the hooked rug tells us something about colonial relations with England and colonial agriculture and trade. But it also tells us something about the Industrial Revolution and economy in America. If we fast forward to the first half of the 19th century, we know that most New Englanders could not afford what they called turkey rugs, what we would call maybe Turkish rugs, to cover their floors. So they made these hooked wool rugs. This was made possible not just because of the abundance of wool, but also due to the arrival of cheap, plentiful amounts of burlap produced by machines in factories. That made making the rugs much easier and much cheaper. And this is a good example of how industrial manufacturing complemented women's household production rather than always replacing it. One would think that the Industrial Revolution would flood America with cheap rugs, and some cheaper floor coverings were made. But the hooked rug persisted. Why? Their production was popular mostly in areas of New England that were extremely rural and isolated. In fact, the rugs were considered a country craft. They took little skill to produce and were utilitarian. The images they chose to reproduce were those things familiar to them: animals, houses, flowers. So we learn a bit about the world around them. Some rugs commemorated events. You see this first one with the eagle is from the early 19th century, obviously pointing to the formation of the American Republic. And the other one is related to the Civil War. Made in 1862, the makers often dated the rugs by weaving in the date. This is a pro-Union rug. Some rugs show whimsy and humor, as in the case of the cat catching a mouse, probably a familiar scene in farmhouses across New England, and my personal favorite entitled The Rivals. I guess this is what you did before social media. So obviously they're squaring off over a cup of tea there, and saying who's going to snag the gentleman pictured in the middle. And then we have some that would just show some of the scenes that they would encounter on a daily basis. We have a courting couple in this other one, and they're walking through a garden, and someone has hooked in the flowers that they've seen in the garden. Similar scene, the one in the top corner, and the other one is the very brightly patterned geometric design. Hooked rugs are never of a solid color. All exhibit some planning of design, revealing that in addition to being functional, these pieces were a means of expressing creativity. In essence, they are art. In fact, one scholar has deemed them folk art underfoot. Our next item is a dress. We do not know the maker, and we do not know the maker of any of those hooked rugs either. For all of the objects we'll talk about today, we don't know the specific woman that created them. So this was made by anonymous. All that we know is that this was an enslaved African-American woman who made this in Staunton, Virginia, sometime between 1845 and 1865, and it's made out of what's termed slave cloth, and we'll talk more about what that is. Very few pieces of slave clothing has survived, despite the fact that the 1860 census counted almost 4 million enslaved men, women, and children across the American South. Clothing such a large population was an industry in itself. These materials were sold to plantation owners by the yard. In the North, several factories made lower quality fabrics just for the slave market. These fabrics were usually referred to as quote-unquote Negro cloth. We have an ad here. This is for servants' clothing, but this was posted in a Southern newspaper. So clearly this is advertising some substandard cloths to be made into slave clothing. These are usually sold by the yard. For instance, a plantation owner's wife wrote to a merchant in 1835, quote, "I must request the favor of you to add 28 yards of cheap calico to my order. Please let it be gay. I have always given a dress of such to every woman after she has a young child. They do so much better being encouraged a little." End quote. The thoughts and feelings of the women who received the dresses, worth about $1 when they were finished, for bearing a child are not recorded. As for our dress, it is made of Osnaburg, the most common slave cloth. It's a plain weave cotton. And we do know that it was made by a slave. What other information does it reveal to us? It reveals status. Most slave women that worked in the fields wore loose, one-piece garments. The design on this and the style show that it probably belonged to a slave that did not work in the fields. It also shows the skills of female slaves and their place in household production. Their work extended to making clothing. Both the neckband and the waist are what's called fussy cut, to display the printed design. So they've taken a strip and the rest of the dress, the vertical, and they've turned it into the horizontal waistband, making the most of that pattern. Piping is attached at the armholes and along the bottom of the waistband. That requires skills beyond that of an amateur. I mean, you really have to know what you're doing in hand sewing to pull that off. However, we also see the limits of sewing displayed here. Decorative buttons are on one side, but not the other, revealing that symmetry was sacrificed because of a lack of resources. While the slave that made the dress remains a mystery to us, we do know that slaves with sewing skills were highly valued. Ads for slaves to be sold noted that when a slave had sewing skills, a higher price was recorded. After the Civil War, freed slaves with sewing skills fared better than those without them, because they could earn a living as seamstresses. But the dress also reveals the internal slave economy at work in Southern society, meaning that slaves produced most of the items they needed. But the household production skills acted as a double-edged sword, giving the slaves some autonomy, but in the long run, it propped up the plantation system. For slave labor provided the plantation's needs and added to their self-sufficiency, and thus their economic power. Slaves raised, harvested, ginned, and baled raw cotton to send to northern and European mills. Then they received the cotton as finished cloth that they made into clothing. So the cotton and cloth formed not just a plantation economy, but a national and sometimes international trade network. Ironically, the cotton used in the clothing was not the only symbol of slavery. The very clothes the slaves wore marked them as inferior in another way. The poor quality of the fabrics underscored that African Americans were in the lowest rung in Southern society. Clothing was an immediate and important visible mark of social status. And you'll see that runaway ads often note what the slaves were wearing. And in this case, it is that Osnaburg fabric that's mentioned there in the ad. And that's pretty common in many runaway slave ads. You see the clothing described. Even the Osnaburg purchased for poor whites was of a better weave, better dyes than that used for slave cloth. So if our slave dress is a window into the world of the plantation economy and African American women's place in it, Then our next item helps us uncover another facet of women's household production. The butter stamp. Again, anonymous. We do not know who made or used this. We do know it's from Pennsylvania in the early 19th century, and it's been carved of wood. So now we turn to the mid-Atlantic. On the eve of the American Revolution, the average American, every man, woman, and child, consumed about 13 pounds of butter a year. Who made all the butter? Women were making that butter. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, women's butter production was an important part of the household economy. Women sold their products, cheese, wool, milk, and butter, and used the income to purchase for the household, while men sold grain, timber, etc., and used that money for capital investment, either new equipment or land. But it was the earnings of women and the fact that they worked for free and that they freed men to do other labor that kept the farm families afloat in this era of financial instability during the early republic. It was the earnings of women that were used to fuel the mid-Atlantic and even the national economy. The products that women sold enjoyed a rather constant market, but the demand for goods by the men, produced by men, was often volatile. So you have a cash-strapped, financially crippled new nation. Women's butter then stepped in as a key export that contributed to the nation's financial stability. In 1796 alone, the new nation exported over 2.5 million pounds of butter, mostly to the Caribbean. All of it was made by women, and all of it was sold for rather hefty sums. When economic hard times hit America after the Panic of 1819, material culture indicates that craft-made small batch butter started to be produced in much larger numbers. Thus, butter making moved out of the kitchen or out of a small building called the milk house to larger and more permanent dwellings, bigger frame milk houses or larger stone milk houses. In fact, many rural areas that bordered large cities and towns, like the area outside of Philadelphia, became known as butter belts. We understand how this happened with material culture. For instance, we know that women were making butter for the market because of the changing technology that they adopted. One example is the butter stamp. This made marketing butter easier. Butter stamps actually originated in the Germanic countries in the 17th century. Immigrants, especially to the mid-Atlantic, brought this tradition with them to the colonies. Men carved the stamps, but they were used by women, and the designs were usually chosen by women because they used them to brand their butter. Stamped butter brought a higher price because you could trace it back to the maker. So women were engaging in marketing. This particular one is from Pennsylvania, and it has an eagle, which again is reflective of that early 19th century desire to put motifs that harken to the early republic on different decorative items. This is actually a butter mold from the Tennessee State Museum's own collection. It is also dated from the early 19th century. There's an oak leaf carved in here. So it has something in common with those hooked rugs that we saw. Women are choosing motifs, not just patriotic ones, but those that reflect what they see around them in everyday life. We also see the adoption of churns, which were not previously in use, but were now needed for expanded production. Women began to buy and use dasher churns and barrel churns. You can see the woman in the background here. This is an early 19th century print with her dasher churn and a barrel churn in use here. That is too much butter for one family to consume at one time. Even though they're eating 13 pounds a year, they're not eating 13 pounds a week or before it could go bad. So we know that women are making extra quantities to do something with. They're selling it. They also begin to abandon the use of paddles. See those butter paddles there? Those are used to work the moisture out of butter. That won't work when you are churning those large barrels full of cream. So they start to adopt what's called a butter worker, this item here. And you move this portion back and forth. It works the excess moisture out. And then that is tilted so that it runs out the bottom into a bowl somewhere when you can toss it out. We also see the expansion of milk houses. There's some other butter making equipment. These are firkins. They become much larger to hold your milk in. Before, that wouldn't have been necessary. Then we start to see larger milk houses. They're usually of stone. They have small windows in them, very small slits, to keep out particles of dust and dirt. You don't want that settling in your cream or your butter as you're making it. And they become larger over time. Here's the interior of one that has become larger. This is actually the first butter making station at this farm. That was abandoned in favor of a larger stone milk house. And here's another insight into women's household production and technology. More equipment, bigger milk houses, bigger buckets, nicer butter workers, did not reduce the work of women. Instead, it just shifted who did what. For instance, now that butter making was such an important economic function, women redistributed their household duties. For example, we see the introduction of more female household servants. We know that from the census. Those household servants picked up the slack of older females. So the older women were now free to do more work in the milk house. Despite the fact that women's labor ensured the survival of the family farm, this did not endow them with any increased power within the family. And this is another reason that their work remains hidden. They cannot buy land. They only rarely inherit property on their own. And they did not control their profits. In fact, in Pennsylvania in 1848, laws were passed explicitly stating that, quote, husbands were entitled to the person and the labor of the wife and the benefits of her industry, because women were unfit for business life. End quote. At the very moment that butter production began to become more mechanized and grew out of those traditional milk houses, is the time that men stepped in and took over butter production. And here we see the houses getting larger. This would have been your traditional milk house, and there's the little slats there to keep the dust and debris out. This is about the time that creating or manufacturing butter moves out of the women's realm into the men's realm. And if you'll notice, do you see any women in that picture right there? It's all men. You'll also notice here, this is where we started with the women churning, making their butter. This is a huge leap from that. It's an advertisement, again, geared to men as not as a household activity, but as a business that they can invest in for profit. Ironically, it is in these butter belts where women produce so heavily for the market with their own labor that we see the first stirrings of demands for women's rights in the mid-19th century. I guess they didn't appreciate the remark about women being unfit for business. Thus, the other story of butter making could be the empowerment of women. So just as mid-Atlantic women were critical to the economy of early America, Southeastern Native American women actively participated in Native economies. And this brings us to our last item, is the Choctaw sifter basket. Again, the maker is anonymous. It is from the Southeast U.S., and we do know the date and the materials, early 19th century, and it's made of cane. Among Southeastern Native Americans, women took on the role of basket weavers, mostly because women in these societies were in charge of agriculture, and the baskets were used in farming practices, food preparation, and food storage. Soon after trade commenced between Southeastern Native societies and Europeans, basket production dramatically increased because they were being used to produce cash for the household, cash income as trade goods. That begins as early as the 18th century, when Choctaw men compelled women to make baskets to serve as trade goods with the English. Before contact with whites, large-scale production of baskets, and indeed anything, would have been unthinkable in Native society. So early Choctaw baskets reveal the changing economic landscape for Natives, as well as shifts in gender roles. Before, women did not produce for the market, and they surely did not take instruction from men on weaving baskets. In fact, living, quote, by labor like the white man, end quote, instead of relying on hunting and agriculture, was antithetical to Native culture. So these baskets, analyzed over time, represent a fundamental shift in Native culture as well as Native economies. Just observing the basket's form tells us about their function. They're used for food storage and production because they have a tray shape. Others are used for sifters to winnow grain or hominy, and that's what this one is, a sifter basket. There's not any pieces missing. It's supposed to look like that. And many have a bowl-like shape for holding grains. We see this especially in these Choctaw baskets. So here on the left, we have one, an early one, and then the later one is actually from the 20th century. They change very little over time. Before and after Choctaw removal to Oklahoma, their baskets retain the same form that you can see here, a form suited for food production and storage. So on the left, again, that one's much older. The one on the right is newer. It would have been made after removal. So we know that the Choctaw persisted in their native foodways because the tools, the baskets to manage their food did not change. They grew hominy in the southeast. Sifter baskets remained prominent both there and in Oklahoma. So they kept hominy as the key food resource in Oklahoma. On the other hand, Cherokees making baskets after removal often produced items with forms not conducive to food production or storage, which shows us that they were changing their traditional food ways or making the baskets for another purpose, in this case, to sell. And here we have this one on the top here is a Cherokee basket made before removal in the 1830s, and this one was made afterwards. You see, if you put anything in there, it would probably fall through in those little openings. Baskets are also important in terms of the materials that they are made of. They can tell us about the movement of Native Americans. The materials, the cane, and the dyes indicate where the baskets were made. So Cherokee baskets made of cane are definitely much older and probably predate removal because they use cane in the southeast. But cane was not abundant in their new Oklahoma environment. So amongst Cherokees that moved to Oklahoma, you would see cane before removal, but the adoption of the material called buckbrush, which is what this one is made of, after. So Cherokees living in Oklahoma turned to producing baskets made out of buckbrush. It is not a very durable material. With repeated use, it's going to fall apart, crack. You can see it would be difficult, even by the shape of the top there, to reach in and get anything out the way that the top of it curves over. Meanwhile, the eastern band of Cherokees retained the use of cane. And we have some pieces that these all belong to the Tennessee State Museum. They're housed here that demonstrate the continuation of cane. This piece actually, I looked at it earlier, is upstairs. A prehistoric basket fragment made of cane, and you can see the continuation of the use of the same material. In the 19th century, this one was made sometime between 1890 and 1930, and this one, I believe, was actually made in the 1970s. So we see the persistence of the use of cane from the prehistoric period to the 20th century. But one thing the baskets have in common, regardless if they're Cherokee or Choctaw or made before or after removal, women produce all of them. At first as household goods and later for a market economy. The persistence of the tradition, even with modifications, tells us something about cultural change as well. Despite formal, concerted efforts to stamp out Native ways, some elements of Southeastern Native culture endured thanks to the efforts of women. So overall, these 4 items, the hooked rug, the slave dress, the butter stamp, and the basket, help us uncover the experiences and contributions of those rendered silent by a lack of written documents. The careful study of these items in their historical context also challenges our notions of what constitutes work. Clearly, work that doesn't earn a wage is still work. For instance, the hooked rug and the slave dress did not generate cash income directly, but their production did translate into savings for families and plantation owners, savings that could then be counted as income or invested elsewhere. These items also challenge our ideas of what is considered art. For over a century, the hooked rugs, baskets, and even the butter stamp were considered crude, unsophisticated renderings of the backward and uneducated. It was only in the 1960s and 70s that such folk art was appreciated as true art forms. The items also make us shift our assumptions about ideal women's roles and their actual behavior. Clearly, the study of these items undermined the notion of man as breadwinner being the historical norm. Women contributed greatly to the family and national economy, as seen in butter making and the slave dress. For not only did women's labor make men's activities possible, but the benefits of her industry directly contributed to the financial well-being of the household and the nation at large. But let us return to the objects one last time. Too often we ignore the humble and the mundane, seeking out only the extraordinary items of the famous, like Abraham Lincoln's top hat or Dolly Madison's shoes, without thinking about the hands that made them or cared for them. But it's in the seemingly ordinary that we find the extraordinary, the work of average people, millions of people that built our society through the benefit of their industry, not the famous or the wealthy. In studying these objects, many dozens of them right here in this museum, we reclaim a lost past and an appreciation of the people who really built America, not just wealthy industrialists, prominent politicians, or famous generals, but the women who worked silently in parlors, in milk houses, on plantations, or on reservations. We may never know these women. Museums have to write anonymous when attributing their work, but anonymous is not meaningless. So when you wonder about who made many of the objects you encounter here in other museums, antique stores, or even dusty attics, keep in mind that anonymous was usually a woman, and while she may remain anonymous, she and the benefits of her hidden work do not have to remain invisible or unimportant. Thank you.
We're going to do a brief Q&A, and I will walk around on microphones. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring it to you so we can all hear.
Were the butter houses made of stone to keep it cool? Is that the purpose? Okay. Did the ban on exports of wool include banning products made, like were they able to export?
No, they would not have exported those. They were usually for household use, just something that they would make because they couldn't afford any imported rugs. They would keep those. And I don't believe they're really exporting any clothing either, because most places wouldn't have, in the Atlantic, would not have wanted woolen clothing. The only place that might have wanted that would have been England, and it would have been very difficult to export it there, given the laws against that. They would cut ice off of the Great Lakes and pack it in sawdust, pack the ice in sawdust, and then pack the butter in the hull of a ship, and away it would go. Mm-hmm. Tusculum University is in Greenville, Tennessee, in Greene County. We are Tennessee's oldest institution of education after merging with some other early frontier educational institutions.
Do you know of any woman or women that broke the mold in one area at that time?
In terms of the butter, there were a few women who continued to make butter as widows or on their own, just a few. And there's the person that writes extensively about the butter production and women's role in that is Joan Jensen. It's Jensen. She has some marvelous work about early women, early American women making butter and how it changes over time.
Can you speak to the size of the baskets and that you were showing the sense of scale, like that must be
They are about, and yes, let me go back to these. Yeah. This is actually, I do not remember the dimensions on this one, but it would have been roughly the size of the top of this podium. Back, those. They're handheld baskets from the little handle on there, so probably about that big. Yeah, they're not extra large.
Were hooped rugs a Tennessee handicraft? I've seen rag rugs, but and I've seen hooped rugs that people do as hobbies now. But I don't remember seeing many hooped rugs in older years.
That is a very good question. Hooked rugs tend to be a New England item because Southerners, for some reason, aren't big fans of wool. So no wool, no rugs. So rag rugs would have been more popular. It spread out of New England in the early 20th century as a kind of a hobby craft at that point when people weren't making them because they really needed a rug on the floor. But they are primarily a New England phenomenon. And women pick them up actually from sailors who would take just pieces of scrap cloth when they got bored. They would whittle a weaving tool like a needle from whalebone and use whatever fabric was at hand. And the first hooked rugs in New England would not have been on the floor. The predominant item would have been a bed covering that you would put on there, like we would put a quilt on the bed to keep people warm. When I was putting this together, I tried to spread it out geographically. I wanted something from New England, something from the Mid-Atlantic, something from the South, and I also wanted a variety of women represented. So that's how I chose the hooked rug.
Dr. Keaton, is it true that the saying snug as a bug in a rug comes from?
That is, as far as I know, that is where that comes from. Yes.
Any other questions? Let's give Dr. Keaton a round of applause. Fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Keaton. Thank you all so much for attending our Lunch and Learn today. Next month, it is April 17th. We'll be talking about Oak Ridge and the Secret City. So come back and learn about that. All right, guys. Have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the museum.
Thank you.